He who wishes to win must inspire more confidence than he actually possesses. Have you ever felt that everyone doubted you except yourself? Have you ever carried in your chest a certainty that bordered on the absurd, that defied logic, that made you look like a madman even to those who love you? And yet, without proof, without guarantees, without support, did you keep going? Faith is the force with which a ruined world can rebuild itself. Carl Jung. That's the kind of faith we'll talk about here. Not blind faith in God's, but a brutal faith in oneself. That conviction that does not come from evidence, but from dissatisfaction, from despair, from the need to exist beyond what is allowed. Machiavelli knew it. Behind every appearance of coldness, he saw a dangerous truth. The world does not move by reason, it moves by perception, and whoever controls perception creates destiny. Few see what we are, but everyone sees what we appear to be. Machiavelli. You can be just, prepared, brilliant, but if you don't seem invincible, you will be ignored. The world does not follow the best. It follows those who act as if they have already won. And here the most dangerous idea of this video is born. Delirious self-confidence is not pretending. It is transforming an inner void into an altar of conviction. It is declaring yourself king before the kingdom exists. It is walking like a myth before the story has been written. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Nietzsche. That force does not need logic. It needs decision, discipline, audacity. And when you summon it, the laws of reality begin to bend. Not because the universe owes you anything, but because you have become impossible to ignore. This video is a dirty mirror, and you may not like what you see in it, but if you manage to face it, if you have the courage to go to the end, you will discover why Machiavelli never feared delirium. He used it as a weapon, as a mask, as a throne, and perhaps now it's your turn. Have you ever seen someone win who shouldn't have won? Someone who didn't have the best arguments, nor the preparation, nor the approval of others, yet they won. You looked at them and thought, how? How did someone with so little achieve so much? Perhaps the answer is this. It wasn't power, nor logic, nor talent. It was illusion. A faith so brutal in themselves that even reality dared not contradict it. Machiavelli knew this, and although he didn't call it delirium, he understood that intimate kind of madness that transforms ordinary men into an inevitable force. He wrote for princes, but in truth he spoke to all those who were once ignored, to those who heard, "You cannot, you must not, this is not your place." And then he whispered the formula. Appearance matters more than virtue. It doesn't matter what you are. What matters is what you project. The world does not reward the righteous, it rewards the convincing. We live as if logic were sovereign, as if facts were kings. But Machiavelli slaps that idea down philosophically. No one follows truth. People follow certainty. They follow the one who speaks as if they had already won, even before the battle. Stop and think. How many times have you bowed to someone simply because they seemed absolutely convinced of themselves, even knowing inside that they were wrong? That is the power of illusion. And I'm not talking about cheap fakery or a positivity line from a self-help book. I'm talking about building a version of yourself so rooted, so unbreakable, that the world bends, not because you convinced it, but because you left it no alternative. Machiavelli lived in a world where alliances changed in a breath, and blood was only another political tool. He perceived an obviousness that few dare to accept. The world is governed by those who pretend with conviction. And here's the paradox. Illusion only works when you live it as truth, when the actor becomes the role, when the liar believes his own lie. That is the moment when illusion ceases to be false and becomes reality. Not necessarily in the external world, but in the hearts of those who observe it. The name of this is delirious conviction, a force that, unlike doubt, does not hesitate, that does not wait, that does not ask permission, that consults no one before acting. That kind of conviction founded empires. That certainty led Alexander, at barely 20, to declare himself a son of Zeus, not as metaphor but as fact. And when he believed it, others did too. Fighting a god is scarier than losing to a man. It didn't matter whether it was true. What mattered was he never stammered when he said it. And we, fragile human creatures, are drawn to those who do not tremble, even if that means following a madman rather than the sane. Machiavelli would call that virtù, not in the moral sense, but as the ability to bend fate to your will. And that force, that symbolic virility, exists only when you act as if the world were already yours, even when it still ignores you. And here the twist begins. You do not need permission to exist intensely. You only need a decision. I am inevitable. It sounds arrogant, yes, it sounds dangerous. It is. But what is more dangerous than living an entire life asking for permission? Look, logic can explain, but only belief transforms. Logic convinces, belief drags. And in a world where everyone waits for certainty to move, he who walks without doubting becomes a magnet. Machiavelli would never say it in mystical terms, but he would perfectly understand if I said, the world is shaped by prophets of their own cause, and the first convert must be you. Blind faith in yourself is not naivete. It is a technology of war, a way to hack the perception system of others. Because when you present yourself as absolute truth, people stop thinking and start reacting. Doubt is suspended, logic postponed. All that remains is your presence dominating the environment, like a prophecy that arrived too early. The question now isn't whether this is real. The question is, are you willing to build that illusion until the world calls it destiny? Because there is a price. There are no shortcuts. It is repetition, discipline, coherence, speaking like a king before you have a kingdom. It is walking like a myth before you have history. It is believing even when everything collapses. That is the difference between who lives and who is remembered. Yes, you may fail, be ridiculed, be crushed, but if you're going to fall, fall shouting with your chest open, I have already won. Because in that assertion, however insane it may seem, there is a freedom that the prudent will never know. And if you keep that flame alive, even bleeding, you will no longer be just another man. You will be a symbol. And symbols, my friend, do not die. Before continuing, have you noticed that the more you break, the less they respect you? The problem isn't feeling, it's letting feeling control your actions. Most people live as if exploding, giving up, or justifying themselves were normal. But none of that generates respect. What does generate respect is control, presence, and the coldness of someone who knows exactly who they are. There is a real way to develop that, and we explain it in a direct, no-nonsense video. Only what actually works. If you want to watch it, scan the code on screen or click the link in the description or the pinned comment. There exists a type of man who is not just convinced of his path, he is possessed. And that possession, that symbolic mastery of his soul by an idea, makes him untouchable because he no longer thinks, he embodies. That is the archetype of the possessed hero. He does not wait to be accepted. He no longer needs to believe because he has been consumed by his own faith. Machiavelli encountered this type of figure, not in mythic words, but in cold strategy. For him, the ideal ruler represented a mission so convincing that others accepted it as truth, even if it was a well-built lie. But here we go further. Let's speak of those who don't merely pretend to be legends, but become legends. Not because others say so, but because nothing within them allows them to be less. The gods watch over the one who dares to be more than a man. Heraclitus. This is the dangerous frontier between delirium and destiny. It is where the hero stops asking, "Who am I?" and begins to live as if he already knows. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, Christ, Muhammad. Men who did not operate only with power, but with absolute presence. They did not ask for space. They invaded reality with a new version of it. And perhaps you think, but I am not a god. I am not a conqueror. I am not special. But what if the secret is precisely that? And what if the first step is to act as if you were, even if you're not, until the world surrenders? Tired of trying to prove the contrary, the first victory is in the mind. The battlefield is only confirmation. Sun Tzu. Those men had no proof. They were the proof. Napoleon crowning himself was not arrogance. It was ritual, a symbolic representation of what he had already decided. I am the origin of my own legitimacy. That is what the possessed hero understands. You cannot wait for the world. You must become the world yourself. There comes a point where conviction transcends motivation. Because motivation fails. It needs context, emotion, reasons. But delirium needs nothing. It is fierce, senseless, self-fed. It is like an invisible drum that resonates in the chest, calling you towards something no one else can see. And when that sound becomes constant, you no longer live in search of meaning. You live as if you are the meaning. From there, everything changes. Defeats become trials. Rejection turns into fuel. Humiliation transforms into baptism. The possessed hero does not retreat at the doubts of others. He reinterprets the entire world through the lens of his mission. That is what Machiavelli would call control of the narrative. But on a deeper level, it is the control of symbolic reality. When you speak as if you were inevitable, act as if you have already won, and walk as if something larger than you guides you, people stop asking whether you are right. They only want to know whether they will be at your side when you win. Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Genius is doing different things, expecting the impossible, reinterpreting Einstein with Machiavelli. The possessed hero has no guarantees but has enough desperation never to back down. And here something dark appears, because that delirious self-confidence is not comfortable. It has a cost. It demands solitude, sacrifice, and a very specific kind of silence. The kind that hurts. You will lose friends, be discredited. They will call you egocentric, narcissistic, arrogant, and maybe you are. But what if that brutal narcissism is what forges the great? What if that exaggerated self-image is a mythic tool, a symbol created to bear the weight of transformation? Look, the possessed hero is not pure, not a saint. He is dangerous because he can no longer retreat. When your identity depends on success, when failing equates to symbolic annihilation, you no longer have the option of retreat. You must win. That is the source of dominance. You do not control the world, but you control yourself to such intensity that the world begins to react to your frequency. That is the effect of myth. You become a presence, a figure, something larger than the sum of your parts. It no longer matters if you have resources. It matters if you make others believe you never needed them. And when they believe it, destiny, formerly an enigma, becomes simply the logical outcome of your deepest belief. When you move with absolute certainty, even the gods hesitate before challenging you. Anonymous, but it sounds like Machiavelli. The possessed hero, therefore, is not born ready. He is sculpted by ridicule, by defeat, by obsession. But when he emerges, when he believes so strongly that even the universe dares not contradict him, he no longer needs to convince anyone. His mere existence is already the argument. If you made it this far listening to this voice like a forbidden confession, then perhaps, just perhaps, you are also being possessed. Not by demons, but by an idea that won't let go, a purpose that won't be silenced, a fire that does not disappear even when everything collapses. And at that moment, the only remaining question is, will you smother that force or will you let it take control? Because the world already has thinkers, analysts, skeptics in abundance. What it needs now are madmen who know what they are doing. There is a very thin line, as fine as the edge of a razor, almost imperceptible. On one side, the visionary genius. On the other, the irretrievable insane. And however much the world tries to separate them, the truth is they are often the same. What separates the hero from the lunatic? What divides the illumined from the megalomaniac? Simple, the result. But until the result arrives, everyone walks the same dark path. And that path is what we will talk about now. Not applause, but the inner psychology of someone who decides to live as a god before the world recognizes any miracle. Machiavelli understood the mechanics of power, but behind political logic there was something more primitive, the internal conflict of someone who refuses to be small. Because to sustain a delirious belief in oneself day after day, night after night, you must construct an invisible empire within yourself. That empire has no walls or soldiers, but it has rituals, voices, secret temples, silences as long as deserts. It is a psychic fortress, and you weren't born with it. You forge it brick by brick in nights no one sees. The greatest battle is the one fought in silence inside a man who refuses to surrender. Carl Jung, somewhere between madness and enlightenment. This is the first secret. Whoever believes too much in themselves lives in constant war with their own mind, because the world will offer you 1,000 proofs that you are wrong and none that you are right. They will call you arrogant, megalomaniac, naive, destructive, dangerous. And worst of all, sometimes you will believe it yourself. But if you manage to resist, if you build that internal empire with discipline, you discover something strange, almost mystical. The mind begins to obey, it stops questioning, and begins to serve. It is at this point where what I call functional divinity is born. It is not believing you are a god. It is acting as if you were, not out of arrogance, but out of psychological necessity, because only thus can you sustain the weight of a dream no one else sees. The internal empire demands control. You can no longer act as someone ordinary. Your words must carry weight. Your gestures must have intent. Your silence must be read as strategy, and all of that begins inside you. If your mind does not respect your mission, no one else will. If you don't walk as if something sacred follows you, no one will want to follow. Machiavelli said a prince must seem virtuous even if he is not, but the true power player does something even more dangerous. He embodies the imagined virtue until it becomes real. That is the essence of the mental empire. You create within your psyche a narrative so intense, so absolute, that your identity will not permit failure. You are no longer trying. You are the attempt incarnate. And what happens to the man who believes so much in himself that he can no longer distinguish himself from his mission? He becomes a monster or a myth, but before that, he becomes solitary. The solitude of the delirious hero is not social, it is existential. It is the silence that screams inside the soul of someone who knows that no one will ever see what he sees until he builds it with his own hands. It is a form of sacred suffering, and to endure it, the mind creates symbolic mechanisms. You begin to talk to yourself like a general addressing an invisible army. You look in the mirror as if preparing a warrior for death. You stop questioning and start ordering. That is the key. In the internal empire, you don't think, you command. And that scares because it looks like tyranny, and maybe it is. But there is something deeply necessary in assuming that tyranny over your own mind, because the chaos of the world does not respect doubt, and the empire within you becomes stronger than outer chaos. When you master your inner world, the outer bows in silence. Foucault, or perhaps only a radical reading of him. The madman loses himself in his mind. The possessed hero builds a fortress inside it. And here we finally return to the line between gods and lunatics. What separates them? Control. Delirium without direction is ruin. Disciplined delirium is revolution. It is the difference between the Messiah who awakens a nation and the schizophrenic who preaches to posts. Both believe, but only one transformed that belief into language, into deed, into dominance. Machiavelli would never have written it in these words, but he would have understood perfectly, because in the end he too knew. The world is governed by those who first master themselves and then others. The psychology of the internal empire is cruel. It demands you become your own god, not in the religious sense, but symbolically. You must be the one who defines what is possible, who dictates the laws of your existence, who asks not for salvation, but crowns himself sacred. And only there, do you become dangerous. Because the man who has built a throne inside his mind does not need permission to conquer it outside. He is already there. Imagine a man seated at the edge of the abyss. He does not know whether he will fall or fly, but he stands, straightens his shoulders and smiles. The onlooker thinks, he has a plan, but the truth is he has nothing, only a raw certainty. If he shows doubt, he has already lost. This man understood what Machiavelli whispered to the world centuries ago. Reality does not need to be conquered, it needs to be convinced. A prince does not need to be virtuous, he needs to appear so. Niccolo Machiavelli, the prince. That phrase contains the venom of power, turns morality into theater, and theater into politics of survival. You do not need to be great. You need to appear unbreakable until the world stops doubting you. Machiavelli lived among conspiracies, exiles, and betrayals. He knew that the throne is not granted to the righteous. Those who best perform the role of king keep it. For him, pretending was not falseness, but skill, indeed an art. The art of embodying an image until it becomes the only possible truth. But here is where everything changes. It is not just about fooling others. It is about fooling reality itself until it bends. You can call it madness, but maybe it is the final step of delirious self-confidence. Pretend so much that what you pretend becomes real. Look, most people live with a borrowed identity. They are poorly adapted copies of other people's expectations. But the dangerous Machiavellian man is the one who creates his own mask and melts into it. Become what you pretend to be. William James. That is the difference between manipulation and transmutation. The manipulator tries to deceive. The transmuter rebuilds himself. He is not lying, he is creating. He narrates himself as a sacred character. And the more he acts, the more the world believes him, and the more he himself comes to believe it. That is when the mask merges with the skin. In the theater of power, there is no reward for showing your true feelings. Sincere vulnerability, out of time and place, is interpreted as weakness, and the weak, Machiavelli knew, are disposable. That is why, in the Machiavellian universe, pretending is not a flaw, but a strategic virtue. You do not act according to what you feel, you act according to what others need to feel of you. This is brutal logic because, at the end of the day, what governs is not your truth, but the truth you get others to believe. People judge more with their eyes than with their hands. All see what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are, Machiavelli. But that raises an existential dilemma. How long is it pretending? At what point does acting become essence? And more importantly, does a true you still exist after years of embodying a person of power? The answer is uncomfortable. Maybe not. Maybe the self you carry today is the result of years of self-theatricalization. But what if that were precisely what will free you? What if letting go of the obsession with being authentic were the key to creating an indestructible identity? Look closely. Authenticity is often just attachment to failure. That old story you tell yourself about who you really are, insecure, blocked, small, is not authenticity, it is prison. Machiavelli proposes something much more radical. Pretend with intention until you become larger than you ever dared imagine. It is not about seeming something you are not. It is about becoming something you are not yet, but that you must begin to represent now. Want to be brave? Then fake bravery until fear feels foreign. Want to be powerful? Speak as if you already rule realms. Walk as one who carries legacies on their shoulders. They will call you fake, arrogant, incoherent, but that lasts only until the act proves effective, because the world resists your ascent until it becomes impossible to ignore. Then what was once pretending becomes legend, becomes biography, becomes fact. Ancient myths were born that way. Ordinary men repeated the same gesture until it became ritual, and ritual became faith. Habit does not make the monk, but the monk without habit convinces nobody. Proverb adapted for Machiavellian minds. And what do you do when no one believes in you? Fake that they already do. Fake with such conviction, theatricality, and repetition that others begin to ask, maybe he knows something I don't? At that point, doubt changes sides and you dominate, not because you are the strongest, but because you are the most unbreakable in your performance. Yes, this can collapse. You can fall apart inside while shining outside, but you can also transcend. You can stop being someone trying to seem strong and become someone who no longer knows how to be anything but strong. Disciplined pretending becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Identity becomes empire. You become someone who plays a role so well that the role is confused with real life. When that happens, it no longer matters who you were. It matters what you decided to seem until you were. Machiavelli doesn't romanticize this. He describes it, and in doing so reveals a dirty but functional map of ascent. If you want to win, you need to learn to pretend perfectly. Pretend not in the sense of lying, but in projecting into the world the version of you that is still under construction. While others wait for approval to begin, you are already on stage, rehearsing, acting, commanding. Because he who waits to become something before acting never becomes anything. And he who pretends with sufficient conviction forces the world to rewrite the script. At first, there is only silence. Nobody listens to you. Nobody takes you seriously. You shout, you impose, you try. Still, the world doesn't respond. But at some point, that internal cry becomes habit, habit becomes voice, and the voice becomes echo. And what was once only a stubborn idea inside your mind begins to appear as destiny. This is where deliriums mature. This is where characters become legends, not because they were born for it, but because they refused to die without trying. The truth is that all great figures of history began as a poorly told fiction. A skinny boy with an impossible dream, a rejected woman who dared to write her revolution, a quiet, strange, delirious person who refused to disappear. And day by day, they built something that wasn't merely a career, power, or money. They built presence. Presence is what remains even after you leave the room. It is what precedes you and follows you. It is when your name becomes metaphor, when your image becomes symbol, when your story turns into a lens through which others view reality. Words can be forgotten, acts distorted, but a well-built myth survives any truth. No one remembers who first said it, but Machiavelli would have signed it. But what is a myth exactly? A myth is not a lie. It is a functional fiction. It is a narrative charged with purpose, emotion, and symbols so powerful it shapes human behavior. If you want to become unforgettable, you must learn to tell your own story as if sculpting stone. That story doesn't have to be honest. It has to be coherent. It must have rhythms, symbols, repetitions, memorable phrases, striking scenes. Look at how the greats did it. They turned accidents into rituals, defeats into sacred reinterpretations, weaknesses into metaphors, Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Napoleon wore a simple uniform before his soldiers. Malcolm X wore thick glasses as if they were part of the uniform of his personal war. Those gestures became icons. What are you creating? Are you just living, or are you writing a character the world will not forget? Machiavelli knew politics is theater, power is dramaturgy, and mastering the stage demands you create something larger than your biography. You must make yourself a narrative that others repeat even when you are not present. That narrative begins in the smallest gestures: how you enter, how you look, how you speak of yourself. You are your own propaganda, but projection is not enough. You must sustain it. And here comes the hardest part. Maintaining the myth requires sacrifice. You cannot be everything at once. You cannot please everyone. You cannot remain small and become unforgettable at the same time. You will have to say no to old versions of yourself. You will have to lose modesty. You will have to protect your narrative with ferocity. A man's reputation precedes his voice. Protect it like a fortress. Sun Tzu and every leader who refused to die anonymous. Reputation is not what others say about you. It is what they do not dare to say. It is built not with perfection, but with symbolic consistency. When you repeat the same gesture, the same stance, the same gaze, you create an aura, and the aura becomes authority. Little by little, your presence begins to alter the environment. People prepare when you are about to enter, adjust their tone, weigh their words. That is not coincidence. It is mythology live. But here's the truth no one tells you. Building this is lonely. It demands difficult choices, long nights, and almost sacred patience. You will walk in the dark. You will doubt. You will be tempted to break character and show your humanity. But you cannot, not yet, because if the legend cracks, before it consolidates, it becomes a joke, and no one reveres what became a meme. Only when the myth is strong enough can you expose the cracks, and then humanity becomes charm. Before that, it is mere exposed weakness. So the final art is this: guard the myth with military discipline. You become an idea, a code, a silent threat, a model of behavior. And it is here you achieve something that even fame does not guarantee: symbolic immortality. Because even if everything ends, what you built remains a reference. People talk about you, imitate you, fear you, love or hate you, but they never ignore you. That is the final victory: to be remembered more for what you represent than for what you were. You became language, you became metaphor, you became psychological architecture inside other people's minds. A man dies, but his name remains, and a name loaded with meaning is more dangerous than any sword. Machiavelli, probably in silence. And here ends the journey of delirium, not in failure nor in validation, but in transmutation. You pretended, you believed, you disciplined yourself, you fell, you returned, and now you are the myth, imperfect, impure, inevitable. Maybe you are still trying to understand what happened here. Maybe you are sitting in silence, feeling something inside you stirred, as if someone had lit an old bonfire you thought had long been extinguished. The truth is, it was always there, sleeping, waiting for the right moment to burn again. Because deep down you always knew, the world does not reward those who wait. It does not honor the cautious. It does not remember those who ask permission. The world bows grudgingly before those who walk as if the ground belonged to them, even if they're bleeding, even if they're pretending. We were taught to fear excess, to distrust those who believe too much, to avoid seeming arrogant. But what if all that is just a polite prison? What if what you call common sense is nothing but armor, built by those who fear trying? Here you heard about delirium, not the empty, insane kind, but disciplined delirium, an armed delirium, a delirium with purpose. that self-faith that is built with bricks of silence, sweat and obsession, a belief that at first looks like a lie but with time becomes your only possible truth. Yes, they will criticize you, call you crazy, laugh, doubt, mock. But that is part of the dance, because the world only laughs at delirium until it wins. After that, it calls it destiny. The difference between a lunatic and a leader is not sanity, it's insistence, permanence. It is the courage to keep believing even when everything seems lost. And the question that remains isn't, is this true? The question is, will you have the courage to live as if it were? Because ultimately, none of this matters if you do not act, if you do not wake tomorrow with eyes full of purpose, if you do not speak with the certainty of one who knows he has already won, if you do not enter rooms like one who created the space. Do you want to be remembered? Then make yourself impossible to ignore. Do you want respect? Speak as one who needs no approval. Do you want to leave something behind? Then become something. The construction of myth begins with the decision not to wait any longer. Machiavelli wrote it for princes, but what he really left was a weapon, and that weapon is now in your hands. You can keep it or use it. You can keep repeating pretty phrases and sharing videos, or you can look yourself in the mirror tonight and say, the age of smallness is over. The phase of maybe is over. Now I am what I invented myself to be. You have every right to doubt, but if you reach this point, it's because a part of you already knows it. A part of you already is it, and the other part only needs the courage to show itself. If you made it this far, it was no coincidence. I do not say that as a cliche, but as someone who once sat at the edge of his own resignation. I had to write this script because some time ago, I myself was surrounded by the silence of someone who no longer believed. Not in others, in himself. There was one night in particular, and we all have one of those, when I lay staring at the ceiling for hours and asked myself, is this over? Was I just one more who tried and I wasn't the one?